Welcome to Successful Living with Bill Napick. Every week we talk about success and everything that goes along with it. You'll learn the principles of success, how to achieve success, and learn to overcome challenges that may be getting in the way of success in your life. You'll hear from Bill Napick, a radio personality and business development expert, along with insight from special guests. If you're ready to find your path to success or take the success you're enjoying to the next level, stay tuned. Successful Living with Bill Napick is on right now.
And welcome to the show, Successful Living with Bill Napick. And today we are honored Successful Living with Commander Chris Hadfield. He is an awesome, incredibly driven individual, most accomplished to say the least. He was the first Canadian to walk in space. He had that dream at 9 years old. He spent a cumulative time of 166 days on several space missions in space. He is an awesome man. And Chris, thank you and welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Bill. Good to be talking with you.
A Space Oddity, the cover that you did in space of the David Bowie song. So awesome. Millions, I think it's over 30 million people have seen that video. Is that right?
Well, just on that one website where my son posted it, yeah, it's been seen hundreds of millions of times. It's kind of funny. I bump into people everywhere in the world, and they sort of look shocked and then talk to me about how that song somehow let them see spaceflight a little different and recognize that that's just something people are doing. It was a really delightful thing to be part of.
Well, certainly in my research, that song, your books, everything you do, I think has given millions of individuals a look at space that they've not seen before, and it's just so exciting. Now, your new book is called The Darkest Dark, and it is a book, it looks like it's designed for children. Let's tell people about your book.
Sure. Part of the core, I think, goes right to the core of your show, Bill, and that is all of us live through our lives, but and we all have different experiences. All of us are do something heroic, do something brave, do something we regret. We're just people. But what do you do with all of that experience? And if you're lucky enough to do something that other people find interesting, what do you do with that? And so I've flown in space 3 times and commanded the International Space Station. So once you've done that, do you just keep it to yourself, or how do you define the success of it? And to me, apart from trying to do the technical side of being an astronaut, sharing the experience and letting other people maybe understand their own options and possibilities a little more clearly, to me that's a big part of the responsibility. And so, yeah, I've written 3 books. The first one is An Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth, which is very much the ideas of it at an adult audience. And then Pictures of the Earth in a book called You Are Here. But this third book that you just mentioned, I thought, the young people, they're just starting to recognize what might happen in their life and what things exist that maybe they didn't even know about. And also, they're kind of afraid, like most of us are when we don't know what we're doing or what might happen. And so I thought it would be really useful to write a book about fear, and a pretty common one, fear of the dark, but how to work through your fear as a young 5 or 6-year-old to maybe accomplish something magical at the end of it. And that was the whole purpose of The Darkest Dark. And the 2 illustrators, they just 2 brothers named Eric and Terry Fan, did a great job. And I just love how the book came out. And it's just airing now, and I'm really pleased, and I hope it helps a lot of young folks maybe think about their own options and their own fears a little differently.
Well, certainly, as I am not a child, I've found it very inspiring, too. I love the illustrations. Certainly, this is a book you would like to have in hardcover, as I have it right here before me. The illustrations are great. I love that Albert, the dog, is also part of this, and apparently you either had a dog named Albert or still do.
Oh, yeah, Albert's a real dog. Albert's a pug. And pugs are great because they're not deep thinkers. They are pure existentialists. Albert is incapable of subterfuge. He just lives in the moment, and so he's a great muse all the time. And so for the book, of course, especially for a 5-year-old, having Albert along in your voyage through young life and seeing the world through a dog's eyes and your own eyes, and then the confusing world through your parents' eyes, I think it's something a lot of kids are familiar with, and Albert is a constant delight. And there's actually, if you go to the back of the book, Phil, there's a couple of pictures of the real live Albert as well. He's getting a tiny bit fat, but that's okay. He's a pug.
Well, also the tie-in that, as I've read The Darkest Dark, I'm on page 116 of An Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth. What's incredible is that in The Darkest Dark, you tell of the story of your inspiration to be an astronaut. And what I find so interesting is how at age 9 did you have clarity as to your goal in life. That's astounding.
When we put the book together, Bill, of course, a young person lives in somewhat, we all live in sort of a fantasy world, our own interpretation of reality. But for the young people, I think it's even more exaggerated. You know, the crossover between Superman and real humans, it takes a while to figure out what's real and what's a comic book. And so how do you portray that to a young person so that they intuitively think their way through it? And the way that we wrote the book, but even maybe more importantly, the way the two illustrators drew it, there's this crossover between the fantasy of how the world looks and then the real imagery. And then as the kids get a little older, the last couple pages also, Bill, which is a direct message from me, the reality of what I had a chance to do and how I got there, dreaming of it as a 9-year-old. It's not just the story of the book. It's a real person, and my own perhaps counsel on how to accomplish things that are really important to you. I thought that was a key thing to include in the book as well, and hopefully it's a book that kids won't just want to glance through, but actually, you know, start thinking about and then maybe subconsciously reflecting on themselves through.
Indeed. And An Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth. One of the things there, Chris, that I believe it's a wonderful business handbook as you talk about goal setting, making decisions, each decision well thought out to take you closer to your goal, whatever that is. But it's, and not to mention the discipline, the rigors of being an astronaut, the preparation, how important preparation, the power of negative thinking. I mean, it is just, it's astounding.
Yeah, well, thanks, Bill. I'm glad you enjoyed it. That book I think it's in 21 languages now, which is really delightful. New York Times bestseller and such, which I never thought would happen. You know, I was a test pilot and an astronaut. But having spoken in schools and businesses, hundreds and hundreds, over 20 years that I served in Houston as an astronaut, I started to notice that there were common themes that allow us to be successful in space flight. You know, how do you face up to the risk of it? How do you work towards something for decades that's probably never going to happen and still stay cheerful? How do you prepare for something where the stakes are immensely high, life or death, and huge financial consequence, when you can only do it for real once, and there's no do-overs, no mulligans? And so some of the ways that we've developed and learned in order to be successful at that, it was getting obvious to me that there are some of these ideas that are useful to anybody. And so that was the impetus behind that first book, The Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth. And I'm delighted to see the huge response to it. But it was also my impetus towards this kid's book. I was thinking, you know, just because you're younger, you know, in fact, you're learning faster, and the world is unfolding before your eyes. And some of the values and ideas that you internalize as a 5-year-old, that's going to be how you view the world for the rest of your life. And so I'd spoken to lots of young audiences, too, because as an astronaut, you end up very much as a role model. And I thought it was equally important to do my best to express those ideas to young people. And that was why we did the Darkest Dark. And even before it was published, it's in 6 languages. The idea seems to be more universal than I could have hoped. So I'm very delighted to see that as well, Bill.
In fact, when I was a child, that was one of the things people aspired to be. We were saying, I want to be an astronaut. I want to be a fire truck driver, whatever it is. But astronaut was way up there on the list for a lot of young men.
That hasn't changed. If you just come with me to schools, I do actually use Skype to tie into schools on a program we call On the Lunch Pad. Just over lunch hour for 30 minutes, I tie in and do Q&A with kids all around the world. And that burning curiosity and that self-imagination of possibility and and such. None of that has changed since you and I were in grade school. As you get older, you tend to sort of think maybe it was only us. But I know from firsthand experience that's not true at all. Little kids are still just as fascinated and dreaming just as strongly of all the possibilities in life as it was for you and for I.
And in the book, The Darkest Dark, as you talk about fear and you reference that, I also want to tell people, if they have not seen your TED Talk, which has had massive views there, but you also tie in your whole life, but you also talk a lot about fear and, as an adult, ways to handle that and some of the things that you ran into in being an astronaut and some of the challenges you had.
Yeah, I think fear is a much bigger force in making decisions in life than each of us gives credit for. And sometimes we let it to our own detriment. You know, it's like a security blanket. You can say, oh, well, I won't do that because I'm afraid of it. And suddenly, it's like you've just built a wall around yourself of something you're never going to experience just because you sort of pulled that blanket around you tightly of, well, I'm afraid. Like, I don't know, you could choose whatever you like. I'm never going to fly in an airplane, or I'm never going to swim, or I'm never going to whatever. You can fill in the blanks. Never going to get married, never going to go to college, whatever. It's kind of easy and tempting to let fear turn you into a diminished human being. And to me, the real essence of growing up is learning to separate fear from the actual danger. And when they asked me to give that TED Talk, they didn't tell me what to talk about, but they said, you got 18 minutes, make it good. So I was like, what do I talk about? I thought, well, I think maybe using my own experience to try and illustrate the important difference between fear and danger might be a worthwhile 18 minutes. And yeah, as you say, lots of folks have watched that video as well. But it is very much at the heart of this kid's book, The Darkest Dark, because I think that distinction, people say to me, is spaceflight scary? And it's people that are scared. Things aren't scary. Just sometimes people just let themselves be scared rather than actually doing the work to understand it enough so that they can go do this thing. And that's kind of a really key distinction in my mind, is to separate the fear from the danger, because that's like opening a door that has been permanently closed to you and allowing you then to do things that otherwise you might have maybe not even allowed yourself to dream of.
And in case someone is listening right now near their computer, I would encourage them to go to your website as we talk, and they could see some of these things, chrishadfield.ca. Is that right, Chris?
Yeah, Chris Hadfield with a D, .ca. Yeah, it's got kind of the links to everything. While I was flying in space, we made, almost 100 videos talking about a bunch of frivolous stuff, fun stuff, but also some serious stuff, and then the books and the music and all. To me, it's all the same thing, Bill, and that is, how do you take the things that have happened in your life, explain them to yourself, but then try and find something useful out of it and share it with the people around you. And the more, the more well-known you are, I think it just increases the number of folks, hopefully, that we can learn mutually from each other. It's really been my driving impetus since I watched Neil and Buzz walk on the moon. And they shared that absolutely wildly. If you think about it, that was the original reality television.
Oh, yeah.
It could have gone so badly on July 20th, 1969, and yet NASA was smart enough to just broadcast it live, let people be part of the experience. And as a result, it was so much more impactful than if they just revealed it afterwards. And so I think I learned from that as a kid, and I think it's a really good and fundamentally mutually beneficial way to lead life.
Well, it's very interesting, too, that you seem to take your experiences, your life, and you're a steward of them as you share your story in a way that it helps people of all ages. In addition, your creativity, you can sing, you can play the guitar, and I, too, am a huge David Bowie fan, and that song, if people have not seen it, go to A Space Oddity, Chris Hadfield on YouTube. But tell us about your creative side, Chris. It is phenomenal.
Well, back when I first got hired as an astronaut, moved to Houston back in '92, my wife was in local stock theater, and she went to this little pub where guys were playing music, and she said, "Hey, you ought to come and play with these guys." And I'd been a musician, but I hadn't really played, in a pub or anything. But I started coming and starting to play a little in public with those guys, and then I ended up playing for 20 years there in bands and fronting bands, and sort of more and more exposure all over the place. I played in an all-astronaut band called Max Q, and I still play music, of course, all the time. So when I got to the space station, I didn't suddenly stop being musical. And there's a guitar permanently up, put there by the NASA psychiatrist, permanently up on the space station. There's always at least one astronaut or cosmonaut who plays a little guitar. And so I was writing music and recording music up there like I always do. But my son, Evan, said, "Dad, everybody on the web wants you to do a recording of Space Oddity." And I was like, "Why? You can't cover Bowie. That's arrogant." But he said, "Just do it anyway. It's not for you. It's for everybody else. Just do it." So I took his advice, and we just changed the words slightly to make it a little more optimistic. But we had to get permission from Bowie, and that was the beautiful part, I think, was the direct contact with David Bowie, back and forth. And when he heard the first cut of it, he loved it. And then the final version, which one day I had an extra hour on the space station, and I floated around filming myself singing the song, and then my son edited it into that final video you talked about that so many people have seen. Bowie he said that was the most poignant version of the song ever done. And now in retrospect, I hadn't realized it at the time, he was dying. This was the last moments of his life. And for him, for David Bowie to see that song he wrote when he was just 19 or 20, for him to see that performed where he always dreamed of being, floating in space, it informed and underpinned so much of his artistic imaginings. For him to see that song recorded in space, on board a spaceship, he just loved it. And for me to know that it put a huge smile on David Bowie's face in the last couple of years of his life, for me, that was the best part of the whole project.
Indeed. In fact, two dreams were manifested, and yours too, because I remember somewhere in reading about you, you said that I never thought I'd be able to play that song in space, because you talked about the time you first heard it and then your dream of being an astronaut. It is, I'm getting chills now, but I was totally getting chills when I was watching the video a couple times last night.
I think people forget. He wrote that song before we walked on the moon. He wrote that song. He watched the Arthur C. Clarke Stanley Kubrick film 2001: A Space Odyssey, and then just did a play on words and wrote Space Oddity. And at first, people, like a lot of good artists, people didn't know what to make of him. It's like, what is that? But now, in retrospect, it's become iconic and sort of explanatory of the whole idea of space flight. And he got most of it right. He was just imagining the whole thing as a very young man. So I never got to meet him in person, unfortunately, but we communicated back and forth. And every time I ever did anything with him, he was a gentleman, he was funny, he was informed, he was imaginative, he was very kind. I got nothing but respect for the life and times of David Bowie.
And also tell us, Chris, as I think it was 166 total days in space, give people an idea. What was that like? What's it like to be that far, that perspective, in that environment?
You know what's cool about 166 days in space, Bill, is that's 2,650 times around the world. And that is, if I could take anybody who's listening, if you and I could be at the window of the ship and go around once, you'd be amazed. It only takes 92 minutes. But to go around the next time, and then the next time, and then the 20th time, and then the 50th, and then the 100th, and then the 1,000th, eventually the accuracy of your understanding of the world inevitably improves. There's nobody there to tell you what to think. Just the actual fact of the world and the age of it and the finite nature of it and the shared commonality of human experience and the rejuvenated nature. We went from one side of the sun to the other while I was on the spaceship. One entire season of winter and summer swapped ends on the Earth. And so you become so much more attuned to the reality of our planet. And it's magic being weightless, and the job is so busy with the hundreds of experiments on board and fixing things, and we had some real serious problems with the ship while we were up there, as you'd expect. But the straight, improved understanding of the world itself, both at a personal level and at a really technical and professional level, to me, that's one of the biggest benefits of space exploration, is we understand our planet now like we never have in history. And hopefully that will help us incrementally make better mutual global decisions as we move forward.
Very interesting. Very exciting. Chris, with the last few minutes, what else would you like people to know?
I think, what's really important, Bill, is what, if your life went perfectly, and nobody's life goes perfectly, but I think it's kind of a nice favor to do to yourself, and that is just take 30 minutes and go into a bookstore or somewhere and see where your heart takes you. What things are really, when you don't have to admit to anybody else, what's really interesting to you. And then just let yourself, gaze and think, if my life went perfectly, who could I be? What would I do? And sort of set that way in the distance in your life, not as something that's going to happen, but as sort of a guidepost of where to make all the little decisions to steer your life. Because your life is not about that big thing. It's about all the little increment. It's about the thing that you do next. That's what your life is about. What do I do next? And what do I do after that? What do I do tonight? What do I do this weekend? That's the reality of your life. And having some sort of long-term draw, like this personally chosen magnet in the distance, to me, that is what really helps then shape a life that you love and that suits you. And it doesn't have to be a one-time thing. You can continue to evolve it, of course, and I have my whole life. To me, that's really the essence of why I got into the things I have and why I wrote the first book and what this third book is all about as well, The Darkest Dark. To me, that's all connected, and it's all about trying to live a life that means the most to you and that you can look back on at the end and say, in my particular measure, that was a success.
No doubt about it. And you have shared your information, your experiences with millions, and I believe you've changed lives. These 3 books, I would recommend people to do at least 4 things. Get The Darkest Dark, get the book You Are Here with the photographs, and The Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth. If you're a corporation listening to this, get it for all your people that are part of the team. And the 4th thing I'd recommend highly is look at Chris Hadfield, FIELD.ca, and some YouTube videos. You will learn so much about the things that you've learned, Chris, that you've shared, and also you learn things about yourself too, Chris. No doubt about it.
Yeah. It's been a pleasure to speak with you too.
Thank you, Chris. Ladies and gentlemen, Commander Chris Hadfield. Check him out at chrishadfield.ca. And thank you for listening to the show. We'll see you next week, and thank you, Commander Hadfield.
Thanks, Bill. Nice to talk to you.